Long before the noise of construction, before the shrill whine of drills and the rattle of foundation work echoed through the valley, there was only silence. My land stretched out over 160 acres of rolling grass, sleepy trees, and a private creek that fed a modest but reliable dam I built myself over 2 decades ago. I had documents, surveyor records, tax receipts, legal deeds, all carefully filed in a weathered steel cabinet in the back of my office. Every inch of fence line had been walked and maintained by hand. That dam I built? It wasn't some cheap gimmick. It had a concrete spillway, a backup overflow system, and a gate valve so tight you could hear the air hiss when you opened it. More importantly, it was mine, engineered, paid for, maintained by me alone. So imagine my confusion when I received a letter. It came certified mail from a law office with a name that sounded more like a brand than a firm. The letter was polite, clinical, and utterly absurd. You are hereby notified that the Cedar Hills Development Corporation has acquired rights to develop housing infrastructure on portions of Parcel 64C77, as recorded in the County Land Office. Parcel 64C77 was mine. There was no ambiguity. I double-checked the plat map and GPS overlays just to be sure. The coordinates matched my east fields, flat land that bordered the creek. The land I'd leased to a local cattle rancher. The land that had never been for sale. I assumed it was a mistake, but the trucks came anyway. Big rigs rolled in with Cedar Hills logos on their doors, flattening the wild grass with bulldozer tracks. Survey stakes appeared overnight, marked in neon pink. A gravel road carved through the entrance gate I had welded myself 15 years ago. No one asked. No one called. They acted like they owned it. I went to the county clerk's office first. The woman behind the glass window looked at me with tired eyes and clicked through a few digital files. Looks like a transfer was recorded 5 months ago, she said. Sold for $1.4 million. I stared at her. By whom? I asked, though I already knew. She flipped the screen. My name wasn't on it. Instead, the seller was listed as Greenfield Development Trust, a shell company I had never heard of. But here's the thing. That shell company had no right to sell anything. Because they didn't own it. I did. I showed the clerk my deed, the original and the updated versions, notarized and legally binding. I demanded an investigation. She gave me a phone number to the county assessor. He sent me to the zoning board. The zoning board punted me to legal counsel. And round it went. All the while the land changed. Within a month, heavy equipment had reshaped the topography. The creek was rerouted, trees bulldozed, the pond drained without permission. Workers brought in modular foundations, began pouring concrete, and laid utility lines. 35 houses. That's how many they had planned, neatly arranged in a cul-de-sac configuration, with matching gray vinyl siding and factory-assembled porches. They named the place Cedar Hills Preserve. The irony made my stomach churn. I lawyered up, but the court dates were slow and dragged out. The developers argued adverse possession. They claimed they had purchased rights from a third party and had invested in good faith. They used obscure loopholes, overlapping property line surveys, and paid off surveyors who'd fudge coordinates just enough to blur the borders. Meanwhile, the neighborhood grew. Families moved in. The HOA was formed. Sprinklers came on at 6 a.m., and dogs barked behind shiny aluminum fences. None of them knew. None of them suspected the land beneath their feet wasn't just stolen. It was sitting on something they couldn't see. That dam? It was still functional. The spillway, the gate, all intact, buried under the manicured sod and concrete culverts they'd laid like a band-aid over a bullet wound. I didn't want revenge. Not at first. But every week brought another letter. The HOA, smug and oblivious, began sending notices to me. Complaints about the unsightly barn still standing outside the HOA limits, about unauthorized livestock, about how my property needed to be brought into aesthetic compliance. They thought I was the outsider. They thought they could regulate me off the last untouched corner of my own damn land. But they didn't know what lay under their foundations. They didn't know the gate valve still worked. They didn't know it was about to rain. And I hadn't told anyone that I never dismantled the dam. By the time the second surveyor's truck rolled past my mailbox, I had already memorized the sound of their tires crunching the gravel, slow, deliberate, entitled. They weren't trying to be discreet. They didn't need to be. The township had paved the access road just the year prior, carving up a sliver of my eastern boundary to widen the route under the pretense of emergency response preparedness. I hadn't objected. I was told it was a public safety effort, and besides, the path had always been a rough patch that ran beside the marshlands. That same marsh, of course, had once been a small lake. Decades ago, my grandfather dammed a narrow tributary that ran behind our property, more out of curiosity than engineering expertise, and it flooded low ground until it formed a tidy, natural basin. By the time I inherited the land, the lake was more memory than reservoir. Weeds choked the banks, and dragonflies hovered over stagnant pools in summer, but the dam still held. It was a quiet border, a gentle barrier. But things started to shift the day I noticed orange flags in the brush. At first, I assumed they were markers for the fiber company. There had been talk of underground lines being run through rural zones, and the occasional neighbor had bragged about faster speeds. But when I followed the flags down the slope behind the sycamore grove, I saw something else, a rectangular clearing, freshly scraped, with the muddy remains of a geotechnical drill site. The machine had already been moved, but the borehole was unmistakable. Metal casings still embedded in the ground, capped in plastic. They had drilled into my land, without my consent. At the time, I wasn't furious. I was confused. I called the county office. They bounced me between departments, transferring me from zoning to records to engineering and back again. Each time, the story shifted just slightly. One clerk claimed it was easement-related. Another said it was part of a regional housing study. A third politely told me that land boundaries can be fluid when under reclassification. Fluid. The word stuck with me like the first warning drop of rain before a storm. It wasn't until I drove to the county recorder's office that the truth began to unfurl. Sitting in a beige-walled room under fluorescent lights, I watched as a bored clerk pulled up satellite overlays and parcel histories. My family's land, 163 acres in total, had been in our name since 1948. The deed was clear. The title was unencumbered. But there, in a new layer, filed under pending development zoning, was a series of plotted outlines, neatly drawn, like puzzle pieces overlaying a third of my southern fields. 35 units, each one marked with a lot number and square footage. Each one labeled, Oak Crest Phase 2, Prelim. I stared at the screen and felt time slow. Oak Crest was the HOA subdivision just beyond the hill, a cluster of copy-paste homes built 5 years earlier on a flattened cow pasture. The development had stopped at the natural slope of my land, hemmed in by elevation and soft soil. Or so I thought. Apparently, someone had decided those limits were negotiable. I asked who filed the preliminary plat. The clerk scrolled lazily, then clicked into a document. A development firm, Southline Communities. Their contact info, an address 2 counties over. No signature. Just a digital stamp, a file date, and a reference to a joint access agreement. What joint access agreement? I asked. The clerk shrugged. Must be in the paper archives. You'd have to request that separately. Took me 3 weeks to get a copy. And when I did, I learned the full extent of the betrayal. Apparently, 3 years earlier, while I was recovering from back surgery and largely offline, a group of local landowners had signed off on a community easement expansion. It was packaged as an infrastructure initiative, allowing utility access across private parcels for emergency and developmental preparedness. It included vague language about topographic restructuring and non-permanent staging zones. But on page 9, buried beneath the legalese, was a clause that cited express approval to conduct soil and hydrological evaluations in preparation for future residential expansion projects, including areas adjoining or within 300 feet of previously zoned suburban development boundaries. They hadn't needed my signature. They had mine by proxy. See, years ago, during a brief stint away for work, I had granted my uncle temporary power of attorney for property matters. It was meant to be used for basic maintenance decisions, taxes, and one water rights filing. He had long since moved out of state and had no reason to believe that the document, still technically valid, could be twisted by others. But it had, because someone, whether it was the HOA, the developers, or some opportunistic legal aid, had tracked down that old document and used it to authorize my land's inclusion. And nobody had told me. The first bulldozer arrived in June. It didn't cross the dam or tear through the heart of the property. It came in quietly, via a carved pathway that edged the base of the southern slope, what they had now labeled Lot Boundary 17. They worked fast. Trees came down. The smell of cut pine and diesel hung in the air. When I confronted the foreman, he simply said they had permits and zoning clearance. Showed me a laminated placard stapled to a post, "Future site of Oak Crest expansion." I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I just walked away. Because by then, something had started to shift in me. Rage, yes, but deeper than that, resolution. This wasn't just about houses. It wasn't just about surveyors or bulldozers or bylaws passed in secret. It was about theft. They weren't stealing money or goods. They were stealing space. My family's land. Land that held the echoes of every memory I'd made since childhood. The land where I built my first fort. Where my father taught me to fish. Where my mother planted lavender in the clay-rich soil and somehow coaxed it to bloom. Land that we maintained, preserved, respected. They wanted to slap asphalt on it and call it progress. And they thought I'd do nothing. They thought I'd fold like others had. But they didn't know about the dam. That quiet, overlooked structure tucked behind the sycamore grove. Overgrown, weathered, still intact. It had been an afterthought for decades. But now it became a centerpiece in my mind. Not for revenge. Not yet. But as leverage. Because if they were going to treat my land like theirs, then it was time I reminded them whose water flowed beneath their shiny new roads. There was an uneasy silence that followed the confrontation at the town hall meeting. The town council had retreated behind procedural walls, and the HOA lawyer, while smug in the moment, had underestimated what silence from a man like me really meant. It wasn't acceptance. It was calculation. I wasn't going to take their word at face value, not anymore. If they were so certain my land wasn't mine, then it was time I proved them wrong in the language they respected. Documents, deeds, and dirt. The very next morning, I drove into town not to argue or plead, but to hire a private surveyor and a property lawyer, one not connected to the HOA or the council. I needed outsiders, people whose livelihoods didn't depend on local favors. My land needed an advocate, and I was done being polite about it. The surveyor, a quiet but sharp man named Edson, arrived on the property 2 days later. He had salt and pepper hair, boots that looked like they'd walked the whole state, and a distrust of bureaucrats that rivaled my own. He brought drones, laser-guided equipment, and paper maps that dated back nearly 70 years. While he worked, I handed over every document I'd gathered over the years, my deed, my grandfather's handwritten notes, the old plat maps from the county archives. Every bit of it, I gave him with one instruction: find the truth. For 2 full days, Edson worked in silence, plotting boundaries, checking markers, cross-referencing coordinates with GPS and satellite imaging. Occasionally, he'd shake his head at what he saw: fencing driven in the wrong place, survey pegs that looked freshly moved, topsoil clearly disturbed within the last few months. There were signs, he said, of deliberate tampering. Someone had wanted the original boundaries to disappear. But land, he reminded me, remembers better than people do. At the same time, the lawyer I'd hired, Rebecca Langston, was digging through land transfer records. Rebecca was ruthless in her precision. She'd spent her early career chasing land disputes in oil country and wasn't shy about stepping on political toes. Within a week, she'd compiled a damning summary. There had been no legitimate title transfer for the 14-acre section that now housed over 30 of the HOA's new builds. No purchase, no eminent domain filing, not even a tax reassessment. In the county's own files, that land was still under my name. Someone had bypassed procedure badly. I remember sitting on my porch the day Rebecca showed me the final documents. A thick manila envelope full of copies, each page stamped, signed, and irrefutable. She looked at me with the same expression you might give a farmer whose field was just borrowed for a new mall parking lot. "They stole it," she said flatly. Plain as day. But knowing the truth and acting on it are two very different beasts. You can't just show up with papers and expect the system to roll over. Especially when that system has already nailed down its foundation, literally. 35 homes sat on my land now. Concrete poured, roofs installed, and families already moved in. Taking it back wouldn't just mean reclaiming soil. It meant evicting people who'd been sold a dream under false pretenses. I wasn't angry at them. Not the homeowners, not the kids playing in yards that used to be mine. They were pawns just like I had been. But I wouldn't let their innocence stop me from reclaiming what was rightfully mine. While Rebecca began drafting the lawsuit, Edson finished his survey. His final report was brutal. According to his analysis, The HOA had not only built on my land, but had also disrupted the natural drainage channels that ran across the property. These channels, shallow and winding, helped carry seasonal rainwater down into the reservoir behind my dam. By grading the land flat for homes and packing it tight with impermeable concrete and asphalt, the HOA had created a massive flood risk. And it was a big if, we got a bad storm season, water wouldn't absorb into the ground like before. It would pool, flow, spread, and there were only two places for it to go: into the HOA subdivision or back into the reservoir behind my dam. The dam I maintained. The dam no one seemed to remember existed, because it had been marked non-operational in the town's records for over 30 years. But that was the thing. It wasn't non-operational. It was dormant, and still structurally sound. I built that dam with my grandfather. Every stone laid by hand, reinforced with concrete in the early 2000s. We'd left it alone because the land had been undisturbed for decades, and runoff was minimal. But with the new development redirecting flow, that dam suddenly became not just a relic, but a linchpin. I spent days walking the ridge above the reservoir, checking the spillway, the valves, the old hand crank system. It was all intact, rusted, sure, stiff in places, but not broken. I had it inspected quietly by a retired hydrologist from the university who owed me a favor. His report was short and ominous: fully functional, capable of release, risk of overflow high under current grading conditions. They had built below a dam they didn't even know was still active, and they had no plan for water mitigation. I didn't take this information to the HOA. Not yet. I wanted them to feel confident. I wanted them to look at my property, see a man defeated by the system, and relax into complacency. Let their guard down. Because timing, like land, has memory. And I remembered every insult, every sidestep, every letter they failed to send, every meeting I was denied. The legal path was in motion, yes, but legal paths take time. Nature, on the other hand, does not wait. One evening, as a spring storm rolled in from the north, I stood atop the dam, staring down at the homes built without permission. Water was already trickling into the reservoir. Not dangerously, but noticeably. It was the kind of flow that, 10 years ago, would have soaked harmlessly into untouched soil. But now, funneled by driveways and cul-de-sacs, it all came here, to the edge. Below me, porch lights flickered on. Families settling in. Lives built on lies. I didn't hate them, but I hated what they represented. A theft so clean it felt like permission. The next chapter of this battle wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about pressure, building, silent, invisible. And soon, something would break. Whether it was legal will, a rusted valve, or the trust between neighbors, something was going to give. And I'd be ready. The trucks came at dawn. Not in secrecy. Not under cover of fog or stealth. They arrived boldly, their diesel engines growling through the valley as if to declare something final. As if to say, this land is no longer yours. And technically, they were right. On paper, at least. On maps hastily redrawn in county archives. On surveys redacted and redrawn under the watchful eyes of well-paid lawyers. The land now bore the watermark of the Silver Rock Property Development Corporation and the stamp of approval from the Oak Valley Homeowners Association. But those documents didn't tell the whole story. What they didn't show, what they couldn't possibly understand, was the history buried beneath the bulldozers. The layers of memory that ran deeper than any trench they'd dig. The roots of my family tree tangled with every stone and stream that curved through the property. Still, the machinery rolled in. First came the graders, flattening the natural contours of the valley floor with mechanical precision. Then the diggers, punching into the soil as if ripping open scars that had barely healed. I watched from a distance, far enough to remain invisible, but close enough to feel the tremors in my chest with every bite of steel into earth. It didn't take long for the outlines of roads to appear, ghostly lines of gravel and marker flags slicing across the land like surgical incisions. By week 2, concrete was being poured. Foundations rising where wildflowers once grew. Rebar standing like defiant spears against the sky. A mockery of permanence. And yet, I did nothing. I said nothing. I made no appeals. No visits to the county office. No angry calls to reporters. No late-night emails to lawyers. I let them build. I watched it unfold like a slow, grinding avalanche. Because part of me needed them to believe they'd won. Letting go of control wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And so the homes rose, 35 of them. Identical floor plans with slight variations. Beige stucco here, gray siding there, asphalt shingles and builder-grade windows. Affordable luxury, the glossy brochures claimed. Eco-conscious living in a heritage valley. Heritage. That word alone nearly made me laugh. Each home had its own name, pre-selected from a rotation of nature-themed platitudes. The willow, the juniper, the crestfall. Not one of them reflected the reality of what lay beneath. The soil here had never been tame. The hills had their own memory, and the river that once carved this valley, the same river that had been dammed upstream decades ago, had a rhythm not so easily rewritten. Still, the buyers came. Young couples looking for quiet, retirees craving community, city escapees seduced by open skies and cul-de-sacs. They toured the models with wide eyes and hopeful sighs. They didn't know. They couldn't know. The HOA's marketing campaign painted me as the old man who had let the property go. A relic refusing progress. An obstacle cleared out for the betterment of all. They never said it directly, of course, but whispers spread faster than formal announcements. I became folklore before the last roof was nailed down. They assumed I had disappeared, that I had taken the buyout, bitter but broken, retreating into whatever forgotten corner men like me fade into once the ink dries. But I was still here, living just beyond the ridge, inside the unassuming cabin that had served as my grandfather's hunting lodge long before zoning lines ever carved through the valley. Technically, it was no longer part of the town limits. A loophole in the paperwork, a forgotten parcel carved from the master plan. Barely more than a shed, really, but it sat at the perfect vantage point. I could see everything from there. Every moving van, every hedge trimmed to regulation height, every community barbecue, every rules committee meeting, every awkward gathering on their overly landscaped green space. It was like watching a play unfold on a stage I once built with my own hands. And through it all, the HOA never realized they had miscalculated something vital. You see, when the land was rezoned and the parcels sold, the developers overlooked one key element. Or rather, they assumed it had been neutralized long ago. The dam. Decades ago, the city constructed the Riverbend Retention Dam about 4 miles upstream to prevent seasonal flooding. It was built in a hurry after a particularly bad spring melt. But what most of the newer city planners didn't realize was that the dam wasn't a full redirection. It was temporary, controlled by manual flow gates and a secondary flood channel system maintained by a series of underground culverts. Culverts that ran directly under the valley floor. Under the development, when my great-uncle leased the original portion of our land to the city for emergency use during the dam's construction, the contract included language that gave our family limited access to the manual gate valve and monitoring station, technically for landowner observation, back when the city still pretended to care about such things. That access had never been officially revoked. The key still existed, and I still had it, tucked away in a rusted lockbox, along with old deeds, family photographs, and the original survey maps no one bothered to cross-reference before the developers began laying concrete. I hadn't looked at that key in years, but now, each morning, as I watched the homes rise and the fences go up, their fences, I found myself holding it more often, turning it over in my hand, weighing not just the brass, but the implications. Because while they paved over the surface, they had no idea what slept beneath. The water hadn't forgotten. It waited patient, silent, biding its time beneath a thin skin of soil and ambition. I did my research carefully. I revisited old engineering files, pulled archived permits. I even made a quiet trip to the county building after hours to confirm the culvert paths. No alarms, no security, just dusty maps in drawers and bored clerks who couldn't be bothered to look up from their phones. Everything lined up. If the gates were opened, just partially, it would take less than 6 hours for the groundwater to saturate the lower levels of the development. Slow at first, puddles forming in yards, trickles rising in basements, enough to cause concern, but not catastrophe. Not yet, but if the secondary valve was engaged, the valley would flood, and not just a puddle or two, a full reawakening, a return of the riverbed, undeterred by cul-de-sacs or garden fences. The land would remember itself. Not out of malice, but inevitability. Still, I waited, because revenge, real revenge, is never rushed. It requires precision. It requires silence. So I let them build. Let the HOA install their mailboxes and solar lights. Let them distribute welcome packets and enforce trash bin schedules. Let them plant their imported grass on top of old Riverstone and act surprised when nothing grew right. Let them decorate. Let them relax. Let them believe they were safe. And while they held their block parties and passed around bland potato salad, I checked the flow gauges. Every day. Every hour. And then, finally, one early morning, as the frost began to thaw and the runoff from the mountain began its slow descent, I knew it was time. The pressure was perfect. The valve waited, and the key, still cold in my hand. The land had been patient, so had I. But water never forgets its path, and neither do I. By the time fall rolled around, the leaves along the ridgeline behind my property had started turning a crisp, defiant red. Nature had its own way of protesting, of shedding the old to make room for something new. But for me, there had been no such luxury. No clean break. No autumn cleansing. Just a slow, grinding war that refused to end. And the HOA? They weren't slowing down. If anything, they had grown bolder since our last confrontation. First came the fence. Not mine, theirs. A brand new, freshly painted white vinyl monstrosity that cut through what used to be part of my tree line. They claimed it was a visual buffer for the new development, but it conveniently marked what they now insisted was the official property line. Never mind that it sliced through part of the old orchard that had been on my family's land for nearly 70 years. Then came the road expansion, asphalt trucks rumbling at sunrise, gravel being dumped over what used to be a wildflower patch I'd seeded by hand. They were laying down a private street extension, wrapping it around the newest row of homes like a ribbon on a neatly packaged lie. They didn't ask, they didn't notify, and when I showed up, arms crossed and jaw tight, I was met with the same shrug I'd come to loathe. "It's HOA approved," one of the foremen said, avoiding my eyes, as if that meant something to me. It was clear now that this wasn't going to stop unless I made it stop. But I needed proof. Not just anger, not just frustration, and not just faded deeds in dusty folders. I needed ironclad, bulletproof, courtroom-ready truth. That's when I called in Robert Dell. He was a local land surveyor, one of the best in the state, according to the county's own registry. A man with 30 years of experience, a steel measuring wheel that had outlasted 3 trucks, and a reputation for being ruthlessly precise. I'd heard about him through a friend who'd fought off a developer trying to shave 5 feet from a retirement property up north. Robert was old-school paper maps, a worn leather notebook, and a GPS system he insisted on cross-checking by hand. He didn't come cheap, but I didn't care. If I was going to war, I wanted the best general on my side. He arrived early one morning in a battered blue truck, steel-toe boots hitting my driveway with the kind of confidence that made you stand a little straighter. He didn't make small talk, just nodded, surveyed the property, and pulled out a stack of old plat maps I hadn't seen in years. "Let's get to work," he said. For the next 3 days, Robert walked every inch of the property. He set up tripods, pounded markers into the ground, and even waded knee-deep into the small runoff creek that used to mark the natural boundary between my land and the adjacent plot. I watched him work in silence, hands clenched in my jacket pockets, wondering if any of it would even matter. On the 4th day, he returned with a binder thick, worn, and covered in plastic to shield it from the drizzle. "Found your line," he said simply. "They're about 20 feet over, in multiple spots." My stomach dropped and surged at the same time. He opened the binder, revealing overlays of current aerial drone shots compared with the original land plats filed decades ago. The evidence was irrefutable. The HOA's development, those rows of gleaming new homes, the sidewalk, the extension road, they all intruded on what had always been part of my family's land. Robert pointed to the edge of one of the newer homes. "They poured a foundation 6 feet into your boundary. Fence is about 15 feet in. Road? That's 20. I felt like the air had thickened, pressing down on my shoulders. This wasn't a petty fence dispute anymore. This was full-on trespass, corporate-scale theft, veiled behind homeowner convenience and HOA arrogance. "You'll want a lawyer," Robert added. "A real one." I nodded, barely hearing him. My mind was already moving, past the survey, past the binder, past even the courtrooms. I was thinking about the dam. But not yet. First, I needed to test the waters, figuratively, and maybe literally. Armed with Robert's documentation, I contacted a local property attorney. a no-nonsense woman named Jenna Cross who had made a name for herself defending small landowners against large-scale developers. She reviewed the survey, cross-referenced the plats, and confirmed what Robert had said. They were in violation. Big time. "This isn't just a mistake," she said. "This is actionable." But even she looked skeptical when I told her about the HOA's behavior, the constant encroachment, the lack of permits, the silence from city officials. Something about it all reeked of favoritism, of quiet backroom approvals and favors traded over country club lunches. "This goes deeper than property," she warned. And she was right, because the next day the county showed up, not to shut down the HOA, not to review Robert's survey, but to deliver a compliance inspection notice for my side of the dam. Apparently, someone had reported unauthorized landscaping and potential erosion risk near the spillway. I stared at the clipboard, numb. They were turning the screws. I let them walk the edge of the property, watched them scribble notes on their forms, and didn't say a word, because I knew what they didn't. The dam was fine. The spillway was engineered correctly. It had been maintained for years. But that inspection, that subtle little threat, told me everything I needed to know. They were scared. They knew they were exposed now, knew that I had proof, and they were trying to get ahead of it by throwing bureaucracy back in my face. It only hardened my resolve. I spent that evening reviewing Robert's binder again. Each page felt heavier than the last, not just because of the weight of paper, but because of what they represented: decades of history, stolen inch by inch, poured over with concrete and HOA landscaping. When I stepped outside that night, the dam loomed in the darkness like a sleeping giant, silent, watching. I stood there a long time, listening to the distant sound of crickets and the faint hum of sprinklers from the new development. On the far edge of the horizon, I could just make out the rooftops of the stolen homes, their lights flickering like false stars. The dam could hold. It always had. But everything has limits, and mine were rapidly approaching. As the wind picked up and rustled the dying leaves, I turned away from the dam, walked back inside, and made a list. Not a to-do list, a timeline. Because if they thought their greatest threat was a lawyer, they hadn't paid enough attention to the land. It remembered. It always remembered. And soon it would remind them. There's something ancient about water. It holds no loyalties, no grudges. Yet it always finds its way home. Carve a new path, build walls, set boundaries. Water doesn't care. It will follow gravity and memory both. That dam at the edge of my land wasn't just a barrier. It was a promise. A quiet one, built decades ago by my grandfather's hands and reinforced over the years with stone, sweat, and an understanding of nature's silent power. The HOA had forgotten that. Or more likely, they never knew. But I hadn't, and I never would. After the county's phony inspection, I stopped waiting for the system to work. The surveyor's report proved they had stolen my land, 20 feet deep in some places, foundations laid across lines that weren't theirs. My lawyer Jenna had filed a formal cease and desist letter, delivered it by hand to the HOA board, and even CC'd the county zoning office. No response, not even a form letter. They were stalling, hoping I'd blink first, probably expecting me to run out of money, out of energy, out of options. They didn't understand that I'd already lost the one thing they couldn't replace: trust. Trust in the system. Trust in their process. And most of all, trust that doing the right thing would lead to the right result. When I looked out at those 35 houses now sitting on what used to be my orchard, I didn't see homes anymore. I saw trespass. I saw arrogance. I saw entitlement stacked in vinyl siding and granite countertops. They thought that stealing land and printing rules on HOA letterhead made them untouchable. But I had something older than rules, older than paperwork. I had the dam. It sat quiet most days, concealed behind the dense trees at the edge of the property line no one but I ever crossed. It had been there since I was a kid, a curved structure of packed earth, stone, and reinforced concrete, forming a reservoir that collected runoff from 3 different hillsides. It fed the small stream that snaked through my land and into the low basin near the HOA's development. That stream had always been steady, controlled. I maintained it myself, checking the flow levels, clearing debris, watching it like a shepherd does his flock. But now, the idea that they built homes directly in the path of that outflow, paved over soil that once acted like a sponge, compacted it with driveways and sidewalks, it made my stomach churn. And I began to wonder, what would happen if I stopped controlling the flow? Not sabotage, Not destruction, just removal of control. Let the land return to what it once was. Let water take its natural course. Would that really be wrong? Legally, I still owned the reservoir, the dam, the land behind it. I hadn't altered it. I hadn't modified the stream. If anything, their homes were encroaching into the natural runoff area without proper water management, a fact the county had conveniently ignored. But if I stopped maintaining the dam, stopped clearing the debris, let the floodgates, already rusted and aging, operate as designed, wouldn't that just be nature? Still, I didn't act immediately. I watched. I documented. I measured rainfall. Early fall had been dry, but November was beginning with storms. Heavy ones, saturated soil, overflowing gutters, the kind of rain that seeps deep and doesn't evaporate. Perfect conditions. That week, I visited the dam every morning. I took pictures, checked the flow rate, logged the rising water line behind the barrier. The ground was softening, the banks swelling. Still, I waited. I needed a push. Came on a Tuesday. Another envelope, another fine. This time, $3,000 for defamation of community integrity. Apparently, the HOA claimed that my public complaints had caused emotional distress for residents and were affecting property values. They didn't mention the survey. They didn't acknowledge the court filings. Just a fine, bold and stupid like a dare. They really didn't get it. The dam didn't care about fines. That night, I walked out under a slate sky, flashlight beam catching the reflective sheen of rainwater pooling behind the wall. I stood beside the old release lever, untouched in months. The mechanism groaned under my hand, stiff from disuse. Not broken, just waiting. I didn't need to open the dam fully. I didn't need to flood the street or ruin lives. I wasn't a villain, but I could remind them what the land used to be, what it still was beneath the manicured sod and stamped driveways. I turned the lever halfway. That's all it took. The groan of metal echoed through the trees, followed by the rush. A low, surging growl of water moving fast, unrestrained. Not a tidal wave. Not destruction. Just truth. By the next morning, the stream had expanded. The flow doubled. The water kissed the edge of the HOA's sidewalk, seeping up into the mulch around one of the houses they had built right on the basin's low point. I watched from my porch as the landscape responded. The ground sank where it had once absorbed. The runoff spilled down the slope in its natural path, the one that existed long before zoning commissions and building permits. By Friday, 2 houses had standing water on their back patios. Not dangerous, not yet, but undeniable. The HOA called a meeting. Emergency notices were emailed to residents. A temporary drainage issue was blamed. The board promised to install new runoff channels, to contact the county for soil assessments. But nothing helped, because water doesn't follow policy. It follows gravity. That weekend, I walked the property line with my phone, filming everything. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I just watched as their illusion cracked. Contractors arrived the following Monday, trying to pump water from one end of the basin to the storm drains. But the problem wasn't volume. It was placement. They had built where they never should have built. The earth was taking back its shape. And the HOA? They tried to bluff. Another letter arrived. This one from a corporate law firm threatening legal action for willful negligence and land mismanagement. My lawyer responded within 24 hours, with Robert's survey, weather records, decades of dam maintenance documentation, and a polite reminder that their homes were built in a historical drainage zone. I didn't hear back, because now they were panicking. The community group chat, which had accidentally included me thanks to an old mailing list, was a treasure trove. Panicked messages about water damage, about flooded mulch beds, about mold and homeowner insurance. They blamed the weather. They blamed poor construction. Some began to whisper about the board, but none of them knew the truth. Only the land did, and the land was speaking again. The dam hadn't broken, not even close, but the spell of invincibility had. The HOA had always relied on silence, on power imbalance, on people like me being too tired or outnumbered to fight back. But I hadn't broken either, and for the first time since this all began, I knew I wasn't the only one watching. Because as the rain returned and the water kept flowing, just enough to remind them what they'd paved over, I started getting quiet knocks on my door. Neighbors, ones who never spoke to me before, ones who whispered, "Thank you." They weren't siding with me. They were just waking up. Because water doesn't need allies. It just needs a path. By the time the second week of rain hit, the HOA development wasn't just soggy. It was unraveling. The neighborhood that once looked like a parade float version of suburbia, with its vinyl-sided symmetry, 2 green lawns, and spotless sidewalks, had started to sag at the edges. Literally. Driveways cracked under softened soil. Lawns bubbled with trapped water. Basements in 3 homes, yes, 3, reported minor flooding, according to the panic chatter in the community thread, which I still had access to thanks to the board's initial hubris of lumping me into the mailing list. But the most interesting detail was this: people were starting to turn on each other. The HOA, in all its bureaucratic confidence, had built 35 homes on land that didn't belong to them. They'd done it under the table, banking on the county's indifference and my silence. But land remembers, water remembers, and now, it seemed, so did the residents. The emails started as polite concerns. Could we request another drainage inspection? Was this area historically low-lying? Did the developer account for floodplain risk? Then the tone shifted. Less curious, more accusatory. My sump pump's been running non-stop. My children's playroom is full of mildew. Why weren't we told about the dam? And then, finally, someone asked the question I'd been waiting for. Who owns the dam? The response from the board was carefully worded, but it couldn't avoid the truth. The dam in question lies on privately owned land adjacent to the community's eastern boundary. They couldn't say my name, but everyone knew. The same guy who once owned the orchard. The same guy they fined. The same guy who had tried to stop the construction and was ignored. And just like that, the story flipped. Suddenly, I wasn't just the eccentric holdout. I was a landowner with leverage. A piece of the puzzle they had conveniently left out of the sales brochures. And worse, at least for the board, I was right. Still, I didn't celebrate. I didn't parade it through town or post passive-aggressive signs at the edge of the neighborhood. I just let the water run. Because the real victory wasn't the flooding. It wasn't the inconvenience. It was the erosion of the illusion, the slow unraveling of their smug certainty that they could take what wasn't theirs and never face consequences. The land was doing the work for me. But I wasn't idle either. While the HOA scrambled to hire emergency landscapers and argued with city planners about retroactive permits, I dug into every file Jenna had sent me. Every deed. Every time-stamped photo. Every bylaw that defined development encroachment and easement violations. Because I wasn't done. The first lawsuit I filed wasn't for damages. It was for clarity. A declaratory action that requested the court to formally determine the boundary lines between my property and the encroaching HOA development. It was a legal way of forcing the issue, of making the theft official in the eyes of a judge. Once that passed, the floodgates, legal ones this time, would open. The filing went public within a week, and that's when the real panic began. See, most of those new homeowners had no idea their back patios sat on stolen ground. They thought they'd bought clean titles. But once the lawsuit landed, their insurance companies were notified. And those companies did not like the idea of property disputes tied to unresolved boundary claims. Escrow accounts were frozen. Sale listings were pulled. One family trying to refinance had their lender put the process on hold indefinitely, until the outcome of my case. It was cruel, in a way. Not because they didn't deserve it. Most of them had ignored the red flags from the beginning, but because the guilt didn't rest solely with them. The real criminals were the HOA board and the contractor who'd cut corners. But there's a funny thing about responsibility. Once the ship starts sinking, people start pointing fingers in every direction but their own. Residents began demanding open meetings with the board. Attendance at HOA gatherings, which once barely broke 10 people, suddenly ballooned. People demanded transparency, audits, resignations, and slowly, cracks began to show in the board itself. Carl, one of the senior members who had pushed hardest for the original development, resigned after a particularly brutal Q&A session in which a homeowner asked him, "How would you feel if your kids had mold in their walls because someone didn't want to admit they stole land?" No answer. Just silence. Then a tight-lipped exit. The board tried to spin it as retirement, but everyone knew the truth. The dam had started to open in more ways than one. Meanwhile, I kept to my own work, maintaining the dam carefully. No damage, no sabotage. Just strict adherence to what I was not obligated to do. I let fallen branches clog the smaller runoff grate. I let sediment collect where I once raked it smooth. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just natural. Nature was reclaiming what belonged to it. All I did was step aside, and the more it flowed, the louder the neighborhood got. One night, a man I'd never spoken to before showed up at my door. He wore a soaked hoodie, boots caked with mud. His house backed onto the basin. He didn't ask for mercy. He asked for help. He told me he'd just learned the land his children's swing set sat on wasn't legally his. That when he bought the home, he was told all paperwork was clear. That now his insurance had voided certain protections because of the lawsuit. He didn't blame me. He blamed the board. And quietly, he asked if there was a way to fix this. That was the first conversation of many. By the end of the month, half a dozen homeowners had reached out, some politely, some with desperation thinly veiled behind civility. They wanted to know, could they buy the land outright? Could they renegotiate easements? Could they work something out directly with me? And each time I said the same thing. I'll consider it after the court confirms the boundary lines, because that court ruling would be the reset button. The moment when the HOA's theft went from disputed to proven. And once that happened, the board wouldn't just owe me damages. They'd owe answers. And the people they'd lied to, they'd want blood. But that's not what I wanted. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need chaos. What I wanted was restoration. Not just of land or law, but of truth. The land had remembered what they forgot. The water had spoken for those they tried to silence. And now, with the lawsuit building steam and the community splintering under pressure, I knew something bigger was coming. The final collapse of the illusion. The reckoning. Because the HOA had spent years building walls with lies and paperwork. But they forgot one thing. You can't dam up justice forever. And when it flows, it floods. As autumn deepened, the wind across the basin took on a new edge, sharp, clean, and cold like something that had waited years to finally be felt. The leaves had long since turned, their crimson and gold shades scattered across sidewalks and storm drains, a natural camouflage for the rot beneath. But even as the neighborhood tried to wrap itself in seasonal normalcy, the cracks could no longer be hidden. The court date approached. The lawsuit I filed, a declaratory action to determine the boundary lines between my land and the HOA's illegal development, had done more than rattle cages. It had upended everything. Real estate agents were calling the board daily, demanding clarity for pending deals. Homeowners were threatening to sue the HOA if the title issues weren't resolved before year-end. One mortgage lender even withdrew from a refinance, citing pending civil encumbrances. That term echoed again and again in community threads, neighborhood meetings, and panicked emails. Encumbrance. The development had become toxic, and so the board scrambled. They hired a third-party surveyor to verify property lines. They brought in a PR firm to soften the narrative, trying to spin the situation as a misunderstanding with a longtime neighbor. They even started pushing blame onto the original developer, a man who had since vanished from public life with his profits and plausible deniability. But it didn't matter, because the facts had already settled like silt at the bottom of the dam. The board had knowingly overstepped. The county plat map from 5 years ago, dated, signed, and sealed, showed the edge of my property ending precisely at the creek's elbow. That same creek had been rerouted during construction to serve as a drainage buffer for their homes. They hadn't just built on my land. They'd modified it to suit their designs. Worse still, I found evidence that they had applied for drainage permits using manipulated boundaries, submitted under the guise of adjacent vacant parcel acquisition pending approval. There was no approval. There was never even a purchase. They'd simply assumed I wouldn't fight back. And for a time, they were right. But now, every file I submitted to the court, each photo, every timestamped drone shot, the real maps, the forged ones, the emails from contractors, worked like layers of sediment pressing down on their lies. Still, it wasn't the paperwork that would bury them. It was the water. The storm hit on a Thursday evening, unexpected, sharp, and biblical in its timing. Heavy rain hammered the neighborhood for 14 straight hours. The basin swelled, runoff surged through the creek, and the temporary retention ponds overflowed. The homes on the edge, those closest to the rerouted channels and improperly graded soil, took the brunt of it. By morning, 3 yards were underwater. One basement had collapsed from hydrostatic pressure. And the HOA? They had no plan. They blamed the city. The city blamed the developer. The developer blamed unforeseen drainage issues due to climate variability. But the residents, they blamed the dam. They blamed me. I heard the whispers. I saw the sideways looks at the local store, the murmured rumors that I'd opened the floodgates on purpose, that I'd used the dam as a weapon, that this was personal revenge disguised as nature. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't touched the dam. I hadn't opened anything. All I'd done was stop maintaining it. And without my intervention, without the bi-weekly dredging, the manually cleared runoff grates, the stabilizing plantings, nature did what it always does. It followed gravity. That storm had always been coming. It just happened to arrive when the neighborhood's infrastructure was weakest, because they had built not just on stolen land, but on ignorance. And ignorance, when soaked, collapses fast. That same week, my lawyer filed the second lawsuit. This time, it was for damages, trespass, land encroachment, unauthorized modification of natural waterways, emotional distress, loss of land use. The list stretched for pages, each claim backed by evidence, maps, photos, and community records. The damages weren't symbolic. At the emergency HOA meeting held that Saturday, things got ugly. Homeowners demanded the resignation of every sitting board member. One woman, whose basement had filled with knee-high water, stood shaking, voice tight with rage as she read aloud from a memo the board had circulated months ago dismissing my boundary concerns as unsubstantiated. A retired veteran called for a vote to freeze all HOA dues until an external audit of the development's finances could be completed. One of the remaining board members stood, Dennis, I think his name was, and did something no one expected. He handed in his resignation, not with drama, not with finger-pointing, just a folded note, a nod to the crowd, and a quiet walk toward the exit. 3 more followed. By the end of the hour, only Cynthia, the board president, remained. She didn't speak. She just sat, eyes dark, jaw clenched. Her empire was gone, and I hadn't laid a single brick. After that meeting, I didn't hear from her for a week. The lawsuit had been served. The evidence was public, and the neighborhood, now fully aware of what had been done, turned inward. And that clarity was fast approaching, because the court date had finally arrived. The following Monday, I stood in a modest civil courtroom as the judge reviewed both sides. The HOA sent in a contracted attorney, slick, overprepared, and visibly uncomfortable with how much evidence I'd brought. My lawyer, calm and methodical, laid everything out. It didn't take long. The judge ruled in my favor. The boundary line was restored. The development had encroached by over 1.6 acres, just as we'd measured. The board's paperwork had been knowingly falsified or recklessly misrepresented. And just like that, the illusion collapsed. Those homes, those 11 properties that crossed into my land, were now legally trespassing. Their backyards? Not theirs. Their patios? Mine. The ruling didn't force them to move. Not yet. But it gave me options. Eminent domain-style negotiations, private easement sales, or full removal orders. I hadn't decided what I would do yet, but the power, it had shifted. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to restore. That night, I stood at the edge of the dam, watching the water spill quietly through the channel. The storm had passed. The flow had steadied. The land, like the truth, was settling again. For the first time in years, I felt still. Not victorious, not vindicated, just still. Because this wasn't about building or breaking. It was about remembering. And the land had remembered me. The HOA had tried to erase me, pave me over, bury my story beneath asphalt and sod. But water doesn't forget, and neither did I. Winter crept in slowly that year. The air turned dry and brittle. The trees along the basin stood bare, casting long, skeletal shadows across frozen grass and cracked sidewalks. What once shimmered in summer warmth was now hushed under a blanket of frost, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled its last word and gone still. The court's ruling had reverberated through every homeowners association email, group chat, and emergency board meeting for weeks. The news had landed like a stone dropped into still water. The HOA had lost, not just a case, but their control, their narrative, their illusion of order. And I had won back something deeper than just acres of land. I had reclaimed presence, ownership, identity. What had started as a simple boundary dispute had evolved into a reckoning, a reminder that property isn't just lines on a map or signatures on forged permits. its history, its time, its memory, and the land remembered. The judge's ruling didn't call for immediate demolition of the homes built across the line. That kind of outcome would have taken years of secondary litigation. But it did freeze all resale activity. The encroached properties were now tainted with legal uncertainty, meaning banks wouldn't touch them, title companies wouldn't issue insurance, and buyers walked the moment they heard the words, pending easement resolution. In essence, those homes were trapped. Occupied, yes, but unmovable. The HOA had begged for a settlement after the ruling. They sent an attorney, not the smug one from court, but a younger associate, to try and negotiate a blanket easement, offering me a lump sum and monthly landscaping fees in exchange for letting things stand. They called it a mutually beneficial outcome. I called it a second insult, because what they were really asking was simple. Let them keep the stolen land, just now legally. And I had no interest in selling what they had never asked permission to take. I declined. Not loudly, not spitefully, just firmly. The associate left without shaking my hand. In the weeks that followed, the board dissolved. Not officially, but functionally. Cynthia, the former president and the engine behind the expansion, quietly resigned 2 days after a group of angry residents stormed her driveway holding copies of the court's judgment. There was no announcement, no apology, just a moving truck that arrived in the early hours one Sunday morning. She was gone by noon. Others followed. A few houses went dark, windows shuttered, lawns left uncut, residents trapped in properties they could no longer sell, with yards built on someone else's soil and HOA dues still haunting their inboxes. The association tried to salvage itself. They appointed interim leadership, rewrote sections of the bylaws, held a town hall where they promised transparency moving forward. But it was like trying to steer a ship after it had already run aground. The damage was structural, moral, foundational. You can't fix something that was built on a lie. As the first snowfall dusted the rooftops in January, I returned to the dam one last time. Not to open it, not to flood anything, but to understand. The water had frozen over in patches, thin sheets of ice breaking gently at the center where flow still moved below the surface. It had become a symbol in the neighborhood. People blamed it, feared it, told stories about it like it was a living thing. But it was never the dam that ruined them. It was their own greed, their refusal to listen, their eagerness to dominate and build without asking permission, not from nature, not from the community, and certainly not from me. And now, I stood at its edge, feeling only stillness. No satisfaction, just truth. In early February, letters began arriving in my mailbox. Not from lawyers, from neighbors, some apologizing, others explaining, a few asking for help navigating the confusion with their deeds. One elderly couple offered to lease back the rear 10 feet of their yard, the part that had extended into my land, so they wouldn't have to tear down a shed they'd installed 2 years ago. I let them. No fee, no fight, just understanding, because they weren't the ones who decided to build over my property lines. They weren't the ones who had erased my fences, rerouted my creek, and rewritten my history. That was the board. That was Cynthia. That was the HOA. The people, they were just caught in the wave. So I started writing back. Not legal responses, just handwritten notes. Yes, you can keep the patio. No, I won't press charges for the swing set. Yes, I'd be willing to discuss easement terms on my conditions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become the arbiter of balance. The HOA had once ruled with fear. Now I governed with restraint. And the more generous I was, the more the community changed. The fear dissolved. The rumors quieted. The tension that once pulsed like static between driveways and sidewalks finally ebbed. By spring, the land began to soften again. The creek flowed stronger, no longer rerouted or confined. The edges bloomed with natural growth. Native reeds sprouted where piping had once cut through. The frogs returned. The herons returned. And so did the respect. One Saturday in March, a small group of neighbors joined me to walk the perimeter of what was once deemed lost property. I showed them the old stone markers my grandfather had placed, the tree he'd carved his initials into, the place where the dam had first been dug by hand. They listened, really listened, because the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to all of us. In the end, I didn't open the dam to destroy them.